Hello, friends. It's a pleasure for me to be here tonight and introduce Tommy. He asked me if, in lieu of a traditional introduction, if I would read one of my poems, but I wanted you all to know a little bit about his background and some of his accomplishments. So I agreed that I would read him one poem if he would let me talk to you, brag on him a little bit first. So Tommy's going to tell you a bit about growing up in Alabama, and I'll let him do that. I'll give you some bio. He went to the University of Arkansas. That's where he got his MFA degree. We met there on the first day of school. And during his 4 years there, he was working on a collection of short stories called Poachers. It was published in 1999. And when that was published, several different groups of people got really interested in that book. For example, the lead novella one was included in the anthology Best American Mystery Stories of the Century. And the Granta Book of the American Short Story. So from the mystery to the very literary, and Philip Roth actually read that story and liked it so well that he offered Tommy the Philip Roth residency at Bucknell. And he said, I'm amazed by the relentlessness of Tom Franklin's imagination. It puts me in mind of the William Faulkner who wrote Wild Palms. So that was really exciting. That was Tommy's first book. He, after Bucknell, went to Sewanee, Tennessee, where he was the Tennessee Williams writer-in-residence, and started work on his novel called Hell at the Breach. It's a historical novel. It was set in Alabama, where Tommy grew up, because it was a very violent place, and there had been class warfare in this rural county in the 1890s. So Tommy ended up writing about that. This was still part of the culture. If the children were bad, the parents would say, watch out, or hell at the breach will come get ya. So he ended up finding this story and doing the historical research to bring it to life in a novel. That was published in 2003. At this point, he had been offered the John and Renee Grisham writer-in-residency at the University of Mississippi. So we moved to Oxford, Mississippi in 2001, and we've been there ever since. So now he teaches in the MFA program there. So it was there he wrote the novel Smunk, which is completely different. It's kind of almost a farce, almost like a tall tale. He calls it a Southern instead of a Western. His work that he's been doing here at the Academy this semester, he's been writing a new novel, but also he's turned Smunk into a screenplay. He was hired to write it by James Franco, the actor. And so we hope that will come to fruition and hit the movie screen so I can buy lots of shoes, you know. All his novels and actually have been optioned now, so hopefully something will happen sometime, you know. So then he wrote Crooked Letter, and that was a really exciting book for us. It was nominated for 10 awards, and it won a whole bunch of them. It won the LA Times Book Award for Best Thriller. It won the biggest mystery award, which is the UK's Golden Dagger Award, but it also won a lot of literary awards. For example, it won the Willie Morris Prize for Southern Fiction. And it was exciting for me to see how many readers came to Tommy through that book. And in fact, tomorrow we fly to Stuttgart because Crooked Letter has been chosen by the state of Baden-Württemberg as the school text for the students who are studying English literature, American literature. So Tommy will go tomorrow to meet with the teacher trainers who will be teaching his book next year to 500 schools in Baden-Württemberg. And then he also won a Guggenheim, so that was fun. And now he's here, so that's the best part. He's here, and I got to ride his coattails all the way to Berlin. So I will read a poem like he asked, and then I'll turn the microphone over to Tommy. This is an old poem. It's from my first book. It's called I Would Like to Go Back as I Am Now, to You as You Were Then. I wrote it because when we met at the University of Arkansas and we ended up trading stories about all our various miseries and heartbreaks before we'd met each other and fell in love, I was thinking, you know, if only we'd met each other earlier, if only we'd met each other as children, we could have spared each other all these, like, you know, various terrible stories. But of course, life doesn't let you change your timeline and go back and rescue someone from history. But in poetry, you can do anything you want. So I did. I would like to go back as I am now, to you as you were then. Then, when you bagged grit at the sandblasting factory, loading train cars that took as much as they could stand, then got the hell out of Lower Alabama, as you dreamed of doing, watching them rumble north with your haiku written on their dusty sides with your spit-wet finger, before changing from your coveralls for your night school literature class, your shame, your hope. Or back further to when your mechanic father gave you a fixed-up car, what you had asked for all through high school, except it was the first Japanese car the county had seen, a Toyota. And when you drove by, the boys called you the rice burner. And the girls, pretty, pious, dumb as Dalmatians, wouldn't get inside of it. So you paid $5 in your empty car to watch Planet of the Apes at the drive-in alone. Or back even further to you in your plaid pajamas, sitting up half the humid night because asthma sat on your chest and crushed, no matter how you cried uncle. So you drew comic books, bulging with muscled heroes, until the blue rumble of logging trucks signaled dawn and better breathing, and you could sleep, your chest heaving with its tiny boy nipples, your legs sticking out with their leg bones. I have loved you for your shame, and for your busted body, which aches for 3 days after we help friends move. Because for years, you were valued like a donkey for how much you could carry on your back. I've loved you for your freakishness, your exile in that homeland where you hid your paperbacks, spoke the local language, rose early and carried a gun if you wanted to walk in the woods. I would like to go back as I am now. Bend over your ribs, lift the damp V of your pajamas and blow a breeze, smelling like snow, sounding like somebody whistling far away. I would go back for a ride in your Toyota. Beat time to your 8-track of Styx with my feet on the dash. We'd cruise the drive-in and park, back row, center. Let the girls gawk at the windows gauzy with heat. I would go back and find you at the simmering factory and free your wet curls from the clench of your hard hat and unlace your boots, almost lunar with red mud, and unzip your coveralls as long as all of Lower Alabama. Go back as I am now and reach in and kneel down and lick you to life, a life we couldn't have known we were heading for. A timely, lucky life, starting just beyond the margins of this poem.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? I'd like to thank Mary Ellen von der Heiden for getting me here. I'd like to thank the board and staff of the American Academy, specifically Thomas Rommel, whose smile always makes me happy, and John Thomas Eltringham for everything from organization to fixing my dead computer twice to helping me get tickets to Doctor Strange. Carol Shearer, from her first shocking phone call to tell me I've been chosen as a fellow to this very morning, she's always giving. I've never met a calmer, kinder person. To Thomas Heller and Renee Alborn, who perform miracles daily. Tonight I lost my book, and Thomas found it for me. And to the people who make our daily lives here at the Academy so pleasant, Axel and Lutz and Fabian, Matthias, Gabby, and especially Stefan, from the excellent service to gifts for our children and the best beer. I want to thank the fellows, my fellow fellows and their spouses, for a wonderful time. Dinners here are amazing. And especially I want to thank Beth Ann. After she gave her own reading 2 weeks ago, Carol Shearer said to me, "You've got a tough act to follow." Well, I followed you for 22 years, and I hope to keep following for that many more. Thank you. I can't get behind a podium without thinking of my cousin. My family was kicked out of the Baptist church when I was about 11 or 12, and we had church in our house for a while until my parents could build their own church out in the woods. And for a time, we had a podium for a preacher in our barn. And my cousin Barry from 4 hours north in Birmingham was a self-proclaimed atheist. I didn't know what this word meant. He said it means you question everything, even God, which I couldn't imagine. Barry in our barn would roll the podium out and pound on it and say, "Jesus died on the cross." Or, did he die falling off a banana truck? Or did he choke on a peach pit? And Barry killed Jesus over and over again. And my brother and I were horrified. And we laughed so hard. I think a lot of my guilt with religion comes from those sessions. What's kind of funny to me now is that Barry is now a Methodist minister. And he married Beth Ann and me. As Beth Ann said, I grew up in Alabama, a tiny place called Dickinson. I now know that it's a hamlet because I read William Faulkner's The Hamlet. There were about 300 people in Dickinson, about half white, half black. There were 2 churches there, both Baptist. The First Baptist where the white people went, and the Second Baptist where the black people went. There was a train track through Dickinson. Someone once told me that a town, the definition of a town, is a place where the train stops. It didn't stop in Dickinson. It went right on through. What I want to talk to you tonight is about this novel, Crooked Letter, and how it came to be written. How it became accidentally autobiographical. And I want to begin by telling you about 2 events from my childhood there in Dickinson. My father was a mechanic, and he drove us to school most mornings. And I'm thinking now of a very cold winter in Alabama, and my brother, sister, and I got into his pickup truck, and we headed out and saw beside the road 2 hitchhikers. A black woman and her daughter. And it was so cold we had to pick them up. And I remember opening the door and they got into the bench seat with us and they smelled like wood smoke. And I remember thinking their only heat is from the fireplace. They didn't have gas heat like most everyone else did, even around there. And we drove them to where they needed to go. They were there the next morning and the morning after that. At some point, they weren't there. But I've never forgotten those trips with that mother and her daughter. And another memory. Maybe it's the same winter, I don't know. My mother was driving us home from school, and we saw walking along the road 2 black children. And they didn't have coats. They were clutching themselves. They were so cold. My mother sped home, left the car running, went inside and got 2 coats, old coats of ours, and brought them back and drove back to those 2 children and gave one each to the girl and one to the little boy. They were probably ages 11 and 9. The girl grabbed hers and ran, as if my mother might change her mind. These two images have stayed with me for whatever reason. They've haunted me. And they came back to me in the writing of this book. This book, Crooked Letter, some of you may not know where that title comes from, but it's how Southern children are taught to spell Mississippi. M-I, crooked letter I, crooked letter I, humpback I. And I know you have lots of long words here in Germany. We don't have that many long ones in Mississippi, but that's a good long one. The book's about two men, Larry Ott and Silas Jones. As boys, they were briefly friends, but Larry is white and Silas is black. And that's not always so easy in the American South. And Larry had one date in his life, and this girl was never seen again after that date. He lives the life of a pariah, convicted by the county, ignored by its citizens. He's a mechanic and he never has customers. Silas, the black character, has a better life. He plays college baseball, moves to Oxford, joins the Navy, sees the world. He comes back 20 years later to Little Chabot, Mississippi, where Larry lives, and realizes what a terrible time his old friend has had. And then another girl goes missing, and Larry's blamed again, and Silas is pulled back into his old friend's life. I'm going to read an excerpt, hopefully about 20 minutes. This is when the two characters meet for the first time. The first thing he noticed was that they didn't have coats. It was just after dawn in March 1979. Larry's father driving him to school and dragging a fume of blue exhaust behind his Ford pickup. The spring holidays had come and passed, but now a freakish cold snap had frozen the land. So frigid, his mother's chickens wouldn't even leave the barn. The evergreens would blur outside the frosted truck window, and him lost in yet another book. He was in 8th grade and obsessed with Stephen King, and looked up from Salem's Lot when his father braked. The pair of them was standing at the bend in the road by the store. A tall, thin black woman and her son, about Larry's age, a rabbit of a boy he'd seen at school, a new kid. He wondered what they were doing here, this far out, before the store opened. Despite the cold, the boy wore threadbare jeans and a white shirt, and his mother a blue dress the wind curved over her figure. She wore a cloth around her hair, breath torn from her lips like tissue snatched from a box. His father passed without stopping, Larry turning his head to watch the boy and his mother peer at them from outside. Larry turned. "Daddy?" "Ah, darn," said his father, jabbing the brakes. He had to back up to meet them. Then he leaned past Larry on the truck's bench seat and rattled the knob, and they were in a burst of freezing air that seemed to swirl even after the woman had shut the door. They were all forced together, Larry against the boy on one side and his father on the other, uncomfortable because he and his father almost never touched, awkward handshakes, whippings. For a moment the four sat as if catching their breath after a disaster, the truck idling. Larry could hear the boy's teeth clacking. Then his father said, "Larry, throw a log on that dad-blamed fire. Warm these folks up." He turned the heater to high, and soon the boy beside Larry had stopped shivering. "Alice," said his father, pulling under the road, "introduce these young'uns." "Larry," the woman said, as if she knew him, "this is Silas. Silas, this is Larry." Larry stuck out his calfskin glove. Silas's slender brown hand was bare, and despite the quick soul shake it gave, Larry felt how cold his skin was. If he gave him one of his gloves, they could each have one warm hand. He wanted to do this, but how? They smelled like smoke, Silas and his mother, and Larry realized where they must live. His father owned over 500 acres, much of it in the bottom right-hand corner of the county, and on the southeast end, a half a mile from the dirt road, if you knew where to look, was an old log hunting cabin centered along with a few trees in a field a few acres across, just a bump on the land, bare furnishings inside, dirt floor, no water or electricity, heated by a wood stove. But when had they moved in? And by what arrangement? His father and the woman called Alice were talking about how cold it was. "Freeze my dad blame can off," his father said. "Mm-hmm," she said. "You ever see the like?" "No, sir." "Not even in Chicago?" She didn't answer, and when the silence became awkward, his father turned the radio up, and they listened to the weatherman saying it was cold. It was going to stay cold. Leave your tap water running tonight so your pipes wouldn't freeze. Larry stole a look at the boy beside him and then pretended to read his book. He was terrified of black kids. The fall after the summer he turned 11, he'd entered the 7th grade. Recent redistricting of county schools had removed him from the public school in Folsom and forced him to go to the Chabot School, where 80% of the student population and a lot of the teachers and the vice principal were black, mostly kids of the men who worked in the mill or cut trees or drove log trucks. Everything Larry couldn't do, spike a volleyball, throw a football or catch one, field a grounder, fire a dodgeball, these black boys did. They manipulated balls as if by magic, basketball swishing impossibly, baseball swiped out of the air, fierce-eyed boys hurling and curving through their lives as smoothly as boomerangs. None read, though, or understood Larry's love for books. He glanced over and saw Silas's lips tense and his eyes move across Larry's page. "What grade you in?" Larry asked. Silas looked at his mother. "Tell him," she said. "8th. Me too." In Folsom, his father dropped the boys off at school, Alice climbing out and then Silas, Larry aware how unusual, inappropriate it was for black people to get out of a white man's truck. As he slid across the seat, Larry glanced back at his father, who faced the road. Silas had disappeared, probably as aware as Larry of the oddity of their situation. And Larry stepped past a woman called Alice, seeing for the first time, as she smiled at him, how lovely she was. "Goodbye," she said. "Bye," he mumbled, and walked off with his books. He glanced back once and saw his father saying something, the woman shaking her head. At lunch in the cafeteria, he looked for Silas among the black boys who occupied the 2 center tables, but didn't see him. He had to be careful, because if they caught him looking, they'd beat him up later. As usual, he sat with his tray and milk a few feet down from a group of white boys. Once in a while, they'd invite him over. Not today. His mother picked him up that afternoon, as usual, and as usual, quizzed him about his day. She seemed surprised by their morning passengers. She asked where they'd been standing. They didn't have coats, he said. They were freezing. Where did they live? He sensed he'd said too much already and said he didn't know. For the rest of the ride, his mother was quiet. Wherever Alice and Silas lived, they were there the next morning, same place, same time. His father pulled the truck over, and the smell of wood smoke blew into the cab with the icy wind, and soon they all rode silently side by side. Larry opened Salem's lot and held it so he was sure Silas would notice. It was the best part, where the girl came back as a vampire, floating there at Mark's window. Wednesday and Thursday passed, Each day the black people waiting, his mother picking him up in the afternoon and quizzing him on the morning trip. Did the woman seem friendly to his father? How did his father act? Was he stiff the way he could be, was, most of the time? Why do you care? Larry asked. She didn't answer. Well, Mama, I don't care, she said. I'm just curious about your day. I think, he said, word that had hurt her, they live in that old place down in the southeast acreage. Do they? His mother said. At supper that night, he could tell something was wrong. She had told Larry to feed the chickens when he'd already done it, and his father had to be reminded to say the blessing. Now neither of his parents spoke as they sat around their dining table and passed squash and meatloaf. And just before she rose to gather the dishes, his mother announced that she would drive Larry to school the following day in her car. His father glanced at Larry. How come, Anna? Oh, she said, in the morning the gas man's coming and I can't talk to him. You've got to do it. She took the dishes to the sink and returned to the table. His father nodded, then looked at Larry before pushing back from the table and bending into the refrigerator for a Budweiser and opening it on the way to his chair to watch the news. Carl? His mother set a pie plate down, a little hard. Enjoyed it, he called back. As Larry dried the plates his mother handed him, he understood that he had betrayed a trust between himself and his father. And the next morning, in his mother's Buick, she turned at the bend in the road where Alice and Silas waited, shivering, holding on to each other. As his mother slowed, Larry saw Silas push away from Alice, just as he would have done. Her drawn face pretty, despite how the cold made her lips tiny, her skin the color of coffee, the way women drink it, her hair in a scarf, but her eyes large and frightened. Honey, said Larry's mother, roll your window down, please. Without looking away from the woman, Larry turned his window crank. Hello, Alice, his mother called as the glass descended. Miss Anna, Alice said. She stood very straight. Silas stepped back, turned his face away. Larry's mother reached over the seat behind them and withdrew a paper grocery bag. From it she took 2 heavy winter coats, old ones from their hall closet, one of hers for Alice and one of Larry's for Silas. These should fit, she said, pushing them out the window. Larry's hands poking at the coats, warm from the car's heater, from the heat of their closet before that, and before that, the heat of their bodies, now going out to the bare black fingers in the cold. Alice held her coat, didn't even put it on. For a moment, Silas glared at both Larry and his mother. You've never minded, Larry's mother said to Alice, looking hard at her, using other people's things. Then she pressed the accelerator and left them holding their coats in Larry's side mirror. In a moment, his mother touched his knee. Larry? He looked at her. Ma'am, roll up your window, she said. It's freezing. I'm going to stop for a moment. My nose is doing all this funny stuff. I'm really sorry. So I'm going to read a few more pages. What happens now is that Larry goes to try to find Silas and Alice in the cabin where they're staying, and he walks through the woods carrying his .22 rifle. Now, thank you. Is it rude to blow your nose in front of an audience like this?
Germans do it all the time.
Okay, all right, good. Everyone look away for a moment. Look at each other. You're all beautiful. Look at each other. Nobody look at me. Don't look. Sorry. With a mustache, it's even worse. Okay? Thank you. Thank you. Now, as he made his way toward the cabin where Silas and his mother were staying, the woods had begun to thin, and as he came to the edge of the field with his .22, he looked over the frozen turn rows and saw the dark elbow of smoke from the cabin's stovepipe. He knelt, a fallen log at the tree line like a wall, the bramble cross-stitching his face so they'd never see him from the windows. He knew the cabin, had been there before, had pushed open its door on leather hinges and peered into the dust and dark where fissures of light showed how poorly the logs were mortared. There had been little else to see, a wooden table and a couple of single beds hunters had once used, a wash pot, the stove in the back corner with its iron door opened and its pipe a straight line to the roof, shirred around the top with bent, blackened patches of aluminum, a wood box coated in dust that held only dead cockroaches and rat droppings when he raised its lid. He wondered now, watching the cabin, if Silas did his homework by firelight. He'd have to lug water from the creek on the other side of the field where the trees resumed. Larry wondered, could he get closer, if he should circle the woods to the edge of the point nearest the house. From here was about 100 yards to there, all open field, just one white oak stricken against the sky like an explosion. Be better at night. They didn't have a dog, or he'd know it by now. "Hey," said a voice behind him. He turned with the rifle. It was Silas, his arms full of limbs, firewood. The black boy dropped the wood and raised his hands like a robber. For a moment, that was how they stood, Silas in the coat Larry's mother had given him, and one of Larry's old thermal caps his mother must have thought to put in the pocket. Silas opened his mouth. "You gonna shoot me?" He moved the rifle. "No," he said. "You scared me's all, sneaking up like that." "I ain't sneak." Silas lowered his hands. "Sorry," Larry said. He put the .22 against a tree and hesitated, then came forward to shake Silas's hand, his father's habit. Silas hesitated too. Then, perhaps because they were alone in the woods, no school around them, they shook. Silas's fingers again in Larry's glove. For a moment they looked at each other, then knelt together to pick up the wood. Larry stacked his limbs onto the pile that Silas held. Silas shrugged a thanks and stepped past Larry and went to the edge and stopped. He looked back over his shoulder. "What you doing out here?" "My daddy owns this land." Larry turned to where the gun stood, barrel up, against the bark of a pine tree. "I was hunting." "You kill anything?" He shook his head. "'Cause I ain't heard no shots." "I'm hunting deer," Larry said. "I had me a gun, I'd kill some of these squirrels, let Mama fry 'em." Larry reached for the .22. "You reckon I could borrow that one?" Silas said. "I bet your daddy's got 25 more, ain't he?" He did. He had several guns. Larry brought this one because it didn't kick and wasn't as loud as the others, 12 and 20 gauge shotguns or higher caliber rifles. "How do y'all get to town now?" Larry asked. "Mama got a car." "How'd she get it?" "I don't know. How'd your daddy get his truck?" "Paid for it." They stood. Silas looked toward the cabin, then dropped the wood again, pointed to the .22. "Let me shoot it." Larry looked toward the house. "Won't your mama here?" "She working." "I thought she worked the early shift at the Piggly Wiggly." "She do. Then she worked the late shift at the diner." "Here go," he said, stepping forward and taking the gun from Larry, who never even tried to stop him. "How you do it?" Silas asked. "It's already one in the chamber," Larry said. "All you have to do is cock and shoot." "How you shoot?" "You ain't never shot?" "I ain't never touched no gun." Silas held the rifle by its stock and forestock, as if it were a barbell without weights. Larry raised his arms and mimed how you'd aim the gun. "Which hand are you?" Say what? Right-handed or left? I'm right. Left. So you're opposite me. See the hammer there? Larry pointed. Cock it back. Silas did, and Larry watched him raise the rifle to his right cheek. Lay your face on the wood, he said. Cold, Silas said. Now close your left eye and look with your right down the barrel. See that sight? Put that where you want to hit. Silas aimed at something across the field, closer to the cabin than Larry liked, and then shot, and the echo slapped through the trees. It ain't loud, Silas said. He lowered the rifle and peered toward where he'd fired. That's how come I like it, Larry said. Can I shoot it again? Go on. How many bullets you got? Cartridges. This one shoots cartridges. 22 longs. It shoots 22 times? Larry had to smile. No, the gun's a 22 caliber. It shoots long or short cartridges. I got longs today. How many you got? Enough. Silas raised it again and sighted down the barrel and pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. Work the lever, Larry said. Silas levered the rifle, and his head snapped when the spent hull flew out of the side. Now see how it's cocked? It's ready to shoot again, so be careful. Holding the rifle with a kind of reverence, Silas bent to retrieve the hull. It's hot, Larry said, but Silas picked it up in his fingers, then cupped it in his palms. What you do with these? Larry shrugged. Throw them away? Silas put the cartridge to his nose. It smelled good. Gunpowder, Larry said. Gunpowder, Silas repeated. They watched each other. Then Silas raised the rifle again and panned it over the field, past the house, all the way back around to Larry, and held it on him. For a moment, Larry saw into the perfect O of the barrel and followed it to Silas's opened eye and went numb. Now we even, Silas said. Then he moved the gun, continued the pan until he stopped on a pine tree and shot. He levered the rifle and this time caught the ejected hull. It clinked against the other in his palm. He put them both in his coat pocket, and it struck Larry with a wave of sadness, a boy saving the hulls as something valuable. Go on, keep it, he blurted. The rifle? Silas, when he smiled, displayed an array of handsome teeth. For real? It was the first time Larry had seen him smile. I got to get it back, though, okay? Pretty soon. Promise? I'll shoot me some of these squirrels, Silas said. He sighted something high in a tree. You got the bullets? The cartridges? Larry unzipped his coat pocket and brought out both the small white boxes and held them out to the black boy. Silas took them reverently and transferred them to his own coat pocket. Larry showed him how to load it and gave him pointers about aiming and shooting, the same lessons his father had given him. By the time he finished telling Silas how to clean the rifle, the sky outside the woods had reddened, and the limbs were darker, and the smoke from the cabin had quit. Oh man, Silas said, grabbing all the wood he could gather in one hand, gun in the other. That fraggle out my mama killed me dead. With sticks pointing in every direction, he raced toward the sun. And only when Larry could no longer discern the rifle barrel from sticks of firewood did he himself turn and walk back into the forest where night had already begun to gather its folds. He felt welcomed by it and full of air. The last thing he did was pull at the fingers of his gloves, removing the left one, the right, and erect the stick the shape of a Y in the cold mulch beneath the leaves. On each peg, he left a glove. So you heard those events from my own childhood in that excerpt. with some changes. And how those excerpts came into this novel and how most things came into this novel is kind of a story in itself. Beth Ann, who you heard read a few minutes ago, is an amazing poet, a nonfiction writer, a novelist. I'm dazzled by her. And she also loves to travel. She's the one who encouraged me to apply for this and to get us here. Back in 2007, she won a Fulbright to Brazil, to a town called Belo Horizonte, which means beautiful horizon. And we moved our, at that point, 2 kids down to Brazil. I did not want to go. I won't lie to you. I didn't want to leave my comfortable Mississippi home and the bars that knew me so well and the friends I had. I was nervous about going to what I thought was a third world country where I would be mugged on a daily basis and where we would all be killed. It seemed like a bad idea. But when she got us down there, it turned out to be the best thing that could have happened for our family. It was a family adventure. And the gift she gave to me was the gift of time. For the first time in my life, I had 8 hours a day to write. Doesn't that sound wonderful? It was terrible. We lived in a 12-story condominium in the middle of this beautiful city. And you would hear roosters crowing in the morning. Vultures would fly past our windows. It was a very strange, lovely city. But then would go off and teach. And our kids would go to an American school. And I'd be left alone in our apartment where I had 8 hours to write. I had successfully avoided it for a number of years in Mississippi. I began this book in 2003. So now we're 2007. Every day I would ride the elevator down and sit beside the pool in our building and stare at my computer and hate myself and not write. This happened for about 2 weeks. Finally, at some point, I started to write on what would become Crooked Letter, Crooked Letter. When I write books, they're usually about the South, and they usually take place in a rural setting, and I write a lot about landscape. And what I do if I'm stuck on a particular day is walk and find that landscape and walk through the woods. And I can see the pattern of bark on a pine tree, or I can see dew in a spider web, or a red crinkly oak leaf, or something. And I find inspiration there. And writing takes place in the details. So I would take these details home with me and put them in what I was writing. But here I was in Brazil, in South America, writing about the American South, and I had none of my comfort. I couldn't go to the bars because I couldn't speak Portuguese. I didn't know anybody, so I was stuck with just myself, and I was stuck writing this book, and I began to go into my memory, and I walked backwards through my own memory, and I began thinking about these anecdotes, the woman and her daughter, the coats. And suddenly I was putting all of these things into the book where I had not expected to. And then something else happened to the character of Lariat that had happened to me. Well, another event from my childhood wound up in that book. So like Lariat, I was deeply unpopular in high school. I didn't really have any friends. I had a few acquaintances. So I was shocked one day when I was in the 11th grade in world history class, when I was passed a note through all the hands. I had never been passed a note before in school. I opened this one, and it said, "Want to go to a movie sometime? Carla." Carla with a K. Let me back up. Carla was popular. She was blonde and pretty. She was dating a football player named Crazy Douglas. But what had happened recently was they had broken up. And now she was asking me out on a date. I played it cool. I wrote back, yes. And I handed it back to her. So now I had a date. My life was about to change. My father was so pleased. He said, "Take the good car." He meant the Toyota. And it was, as Beth Ann said, the only Toyota in Clark County, so everybody knew it. He gave me $20, which was a lot of money in 1979. And I had a week to get through before my date. And I thought about that date all week. And I looked at my reflection in the mirror and I thought, God, I'm happy. I'm so glad I have this date. And I told a couple of people about it, which was a mistake. And finally, Friday rolled around and I got into the Toyota and I drove to Carla's house and I picked her up. And guess where we were going? To the drive-in movie. My brother and I had gone to the drive-in every Friday night since I could drive. And I'll tell you why. They showed R-rated movies. This is before the internet or cable. So a boy in Alabama had no chance to see nudity, except at the drive-in movie. And R-rated movies had breasts of women. And that's what I wanted to see. So every Friday night, Jeff and I went and watched these movies. But we also noticed that back by the trees, couples parked, and their windows got all gauzy, I think you said. It got fogged up. They were having sex in those cars. I wanted to have sex very badly. So I now had a chance. Carla and I are driving to the drive-in for me to have sex with her. And I even brought a blanket in the back of the car in case we got cold. But on the way, she said, Tommy, I have a favor to ask. And I said, what? She said, I need to go see Crazy Douglas. My parents will only let me go out with you. They think you're safe. And I was. I said, but we're going to the drive-in. She said, I've got to. And I said, she said, I'm going to have a little bitty baby. He's the father. I've got to see him. I said, okay. I took her to his trailer in the woods and left her there. She said, come get me in 4 hours. So I had 4 hours to kill. So me and the Toyota drove to the drive-in and paid $5 to watch the 2 movies by myself. It's not a bargain. $5 a carload if you're alone. But I pulled way close to the front so nobody would recognize me. But it was the only Toyota in Clark County. And I sat there waiting for it to get dark. I thought it was never going to get dark. And finally, the previews began to roll and it started to get a little darker. And I thought I pulled it off. About that time, Tommy Phillips in his green Chevy pickup pulled in behind me. And there I am, trapped, caught at the drive-in with no date. I thought fast. I grabbed that blanket out of the back, put it over my hand, as if it were my date. And it had been for a number of years. And Carla and I watched the movie that way. My arm got tired. My fingers began to tingle. Then they got numb. I had to hold it up like this. I thought the movie would never end. And finally it did. And I thought, we'll only stay for the first feature, Carla and me. So I drove us out, turning my hand to keep her head in 3D. And I had 2 hours to kill. So I rode around listening to the Eagles, Hotel California on my 8-track player. And the song that struck me that night was Victim of Love. That was me. Finally, those 2 hours passed. I went back to Crazy Douglas's trailer, and I picked her up. They made out against the back of the car saying goodnight, so hard it moved the car. Then I drove her home. At the door, she said, thanks, you're a real friend. And I went home. And then a couple of weeks later, in the cafeteria line, I said to her, what about the baby? Oh, false alarm, she said. For me, these are anecdotes. These 3 things I've told you about. And I tell them, and people laugh sometimes, or they feel sorry for me, or both. And I, down there in Brazil, used these events and many others from my own life to form a character called Lariat, who's my doppelganger, who has everything in common with me except for I have a different father, and I had a brother and cousins. So I had, in a way, a better life than Lariat, the character, has. Because his date is never seen again. His life is changed, is ruined, where mine was just the one night. I will end by telling you one more thing about my first date, Carla, where she is now. After high school, she got married and then divorced. And then she shot her ex-husband in the back of the head while he slept. She's in prison. She's in the Julia B. Tutwiler Prison for Women for life. I'm here. I'd rather be here in Berlin. Thank you. Thank you. And now I'd love to answer questions if anybody has them. Athena has a microphone. Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
I was recently reading an article where Junot Diaz was talking about his rediscovery of his love for the short story. Now, you have written short stories and you've written novels, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to what draws and inspires you to each type of writing at what particular times, and what you've learned over the years about the process of the conciseness of short stories and the sprawl of novels, and anything that you would like to share about your experience with them.
Yes, thank you. I love short stories and I love novels. They're very different animals to write. Most writers learn to write by writing short stories because you're able to write a beginning, a middle, and end. You see the whole thing. And novels, being so much longer, require so much time. So you need the repetition of beginning and ending something to be able to, I think, get good at it. Short stories give you the great thing of instant gratification, or not instant, but quicker gratification. You can write a short story, a draft of one, in a weekend, whereas a novel, it's so much different. When I sold my first novel, they gave me 9 months to write it, and I thought, well, I can do that. For 9 months, I did nothing except worry. I found it so hard to write a novel. It's like clocking in at a factory every day and going to work. You can write 8 or 10 pages, and it's only a fraction of the novel. So for me, it's a very different experience of writing. Unfortunately, for some reason, people don't read short stories as much as they should, where everything else is getting smaller. Our phones are getting smaller. Our lives are getting quicker. We have microwaves and drive-thrus. Why don't we like quick stories? Why do we want to read novels? My wife is writing a thing called micro-memoirs, which I'm hoping will maybe reinvigorate the small, short form. Thank you. Yes? She's bringing you the microphone. Thank you.
Yeah. When you have such powerful memories, how do you let go of them so that they can become integrated and become fictional if they need to for the story?
They are powerful memories, and there's usually some part of them that sticks. For me, with the woman and her daughter, it was the smell. And smell is the sense most powerfully linked with memory. Sometimes I'm not aware that they're memories until I begin to write about them, and they come out in a story and surprise me. There's a pretty sad event. It happens in Larry's life that happened in my life, where I was invited one year to a haunted house. I wasn't, as I said, not a popular kid, but I had a great monster mask, and I wore it to school one day on Halloween, to impress the girls. And I remember they all wanted to try it on, and I would get it back, and it would smell like their breath, like certs and hairspray. And it was so wonderful. And they said, come to our haunted house tonight, Tommy. So I went. And I was there, and I scared people for 2 or 3 hours. And after that was over, I came out, took off my mask, my hair was all sweaty, and I realized they were all in cliques. And they all hung out after school, and I'd never done that. So I realized, they're all friends. And I thought, well, I'll go hang out with this clique. But I walked over, and they just sort of turned away. To another group, they turned away. This memory I sort of buried for obvious reasons. But as I began to write about Larry, it bubbled up the way that things do sometimes. I think, to me, writing comes from the same place. Fiction writing comes from the same place that dreams do. And I think dreams tell you about yourself. And sometimes fiction does as well. So sometimes the good memory, sometimes the bad. Sometimes ones that I thought about. I wanted for a long time to write about my dating my hand, if you will. Because it just was something I thought was interesting and pathetic and kind of funny. And I tried to make it a funny story for a long time, and I couldn't make it work. But then when I began to write this, suddenly it just sort of plugged itself in. So I don't know if that's a very good answer, but I think that sometimes they're there and sometimes they're not, and hopefully they put themselves into the book or the story. For me, the best part of writing is when the characters surprise me. I didn't see that coming. That's always a great experience. I know then that it's working well. Babette?
Wonderful, and I'm looking forward to reading everything. But what struck me again, like in the Tilted world, is that objects, maybe that's my focus too, but objects play a significant role in the narratives that you presented today. So we have the Toyota, and the coats, and then the gun. And I'm wondering, so the Toyota has this, aspect of globalization bringing in something from the outside, and it's coded, and it's not good for the protagonist. And then you have the coats, and I'm wondering, they play a part in providing some warmth and some comfort, but they're also awkward in a way, given that they're a gift, and they somehow negotiate the racial relationships there. And then the gun, of course, a weapon that you can kill with, and that is also used in this ambivalent way, but also ultimately seems to be the beginning of the friendship. So I'm wondering whether you use these objects consciously as media, social media between the people, or how do they happen to... Yeah. I know it's like going back to your actual memory with the codes, but yeah. So I'm just wondering, it seems to be that these objects are all significant in one way or the other.
I think they should be. If they're in the book, they need to be there for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting is I never know why they need to be there at first. I didn't mean for the rifle to have deeper significance when I wrote that scene. It was just a rifle. Or the truck or the cars. I don't think a writer, especially in earlier drafts, should think about what something means. Just let it make sense on the page. Later you can think about how it's significant, how the rifle links the two characters. But only later will I think of that. Sorry. That's a hard question.
But is sometimes a rifle just a rifle?
I think a rifle's never just a rifle. Yes, in the back here. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Hi.
Hi.
You told us quite a lot about how much of you there is in Larry. When I read it, actually, Silas was kind of the character that I fell for. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about where Silas comes from?
Yes. I was talking with Rudy before this. He was asking about the character of Wallace Stringfellow, who is not such a good character. But I love Wallace. And Silas is also part of me. I did grow up in this tiny place in Alabama, but I moved. I went north to Arkansas, which is kind of a joke because it's still the South. But I left the part of the world where most of my family still lives and got away from that and met people who were not just from that general area. And I think got a broader perspective on the South. I think one, to really appreciate the South, the American South, needs to leave it, view it from afar, and then perhaps come back. So that's one thing Silas does. He's from there, leaves, and then comes back there. So he has, I think, a broader perspective of it, as I do. Okay, sorry. Typically, Southerners, this one in particular, gives long answers. These have been short answers so far. Alex had a question, didn't you?
Thanks very much. It's a very general question, but it's a question as a writer of nonfiction. I've always wanted to ask a writer of fiction, which is what role does an editor play? How much intervention, shaping takes place in terms of bringing out these stories, these memories, maybe making them go in a different direction? I'm just kind of curious how much editorial intervention there is.
There's less and less as each year passes. As the years pass, editors edit a lot less and do more marketing. What's happening now in New York and around the world, I would guess, is that agents are doing more editing. Agents see the books earlier than editors do, and they push it further along. And so when an editor gets it now, it's a bit more what it will need to be, simply because editors are so busy doing other things. In my case, and I think most writers' cases, they have a few key readers. My first reader is Beth Ann. She reads things very hard. She's the toughest editor I've ever worked with. She has my best interest at heart. She loves me, and she wants me to succeed and wants the book to succeed. So she bashes the hell out of it, and it needs it. It needs it. And then I send it to other close friends who are readers, and they read it. So when my agent gets it, it's often pretty far along. And then when the editor gets it, it's even further along. So part of it's that, but part of it is they have so many other jobs now, editors. So they don't do what they used to. It's no longer the age of Maxwell Perkins, Thomas Wolfe's famous editor, who would receive a trunk of manuscript pages and make a novel out of it. It's no longer that. I wish it were. It'd be easier for the writer. It's getting harder for the writer.
Thank you very much. I'm interested in your audience. Do you know who reads your books? And I would be especially interested if there's any black audience too.
I hope so. I hope so. The first 3 books really nobody read. It's the sad truth. This book gained a wider audience, and I figured out why. The first 3 books are about characters who are often kind of subhuman. They're monsters. They're mean, violent, wretched people. And most people today don't necessarily identify with mean, violent, wretched people. In this book, there are 2 characters that people can root for. So it took me 4 books to realize it's one of Kurt Vonnegut's rules of writing. He has 8 of them. One of them is always give your reader a character he or she can root for. It took me a long time to learn that. Well, should we say goodnight and go have some cocktails? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.